Thank you, Christos, for these very generous, warm, kind words of introduction. Today we'll talk about politics. No, I will talk about something different. Now here's two fundamental questions. You want to know how fast your spoon is going to get hot and why are tomatoes red. Now the first, we know the answer. It's a very concise equation. You solve it. Now the other one, this is the best we know. It looks quite different. Now the first one is a PDE, we teach this in school. The second one is what I call a natural algorithm or an algorithm because it's got loops, conditionals, memory, so it qualifies as an algorithm. And it's natural simply because we did not get to design it, at least not till now. Now you look at this, some people rejoice, others are terrified because you can say, well, are we so sure this is really going to do it? That's one question to ask. Another one is, are these the right variables? Now this is important. It took decades in the 19th century to figure out that when you try to build a steam engine, at the end of the day, there are thousands of different parameters. At the end of the day, there's only 5 or 6 that matter. You know, that's the whole field of thermodynamics. And you've got to look at the right things. But then, even let's assume that we looked at the right thing, we had the right algorithm and everything, then what do we do with it? We just simulate it? What's the point? Well, maybe big data will save the day. I actually don't believe that. And look at this. Maybe some of you recognize, others don't. It's a chip. And now you can spend the biggest supercomputers in the world to do big data on this. You could point electrodes everywhere, put voltages, potentials, just record everything, make long lists, and just do everything possibly supercomputers can do. You'll never find out what it is. It computes RSA. And there's a very deep reason why one would not lead to the other. Now, I'd like to say beware of linear A, not just because Christos is here. Linear A was a language in ancient Crete. And we know, well, when I say we, I don't include myself, but we know everything about it, except for one detail. We don't have a clue what it means. But except for that, we know everything. And my point is that you're going to need some kind of a theory. Just simply cramming data in and out of this won't do it. And so what kind of theory? Well, right now, there's not so much of a choice. So how about mathematics? That has worked in physics. Maybe it'll work again. So, you know, Gelfand, mathematician turned biologist, you know, had these words to say about the only thing more unreasonable than the effectiveness of mathematics in physics is its ineffectiveness in biology, which didn't stop him from doing it. Now, of course, this was in reply to a famous quip by Wigner about he admired the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics in the natural sciences. And you have to ask, why is it so different? Well, I think actually the answer at a high level is very simple. Biology is physics plus history, the history of evolution. And math has a problem with history. So what I mean is this natural algorithm really has to be looked at not just as a set of differential equations as mathematics, but also as a historical document. And you know, history is very difficult, much more difficult than mathematics. Because history may repeat itself, but you only wish. Certainly not quite enough for mathematicians to make any sense of it, because mathematics is the language of symmetry, of repetition, of structure, precisely what history is not. On the other hand, I will make the case, but I won't have time to develop this here, that algorithms gives you the language of memory. And now let's go back to Turing. Always have to go back to Turing somehow. And you know, you've got the universal Turing machine, you've got the head, you've got the program on the left or data on the right. We all understand this, we teach this in school. Maybe we don't teach that the distinction between program and data is not intrinsic to computation. That's something we put in because of our cultural biases, such as being mathematicians, being engineers, being problem solvers. Computers solve problems, okay? Data, we think of problem instances. And then program, we think of solvers, because we like to solve things. But who says nature wants to solve things? It's not, I mean, pretty much the only game in town in the living world is to live. That's pretty much it. So, in fact, if you try to come up with a principled definition of a program, it's tough, okay? Now, I'm not saying about the famous duality between program and data, between semantics and syntax. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm just saying, if you're a Martian and you land on a universal Turing machine, lucky you, then how can you tell which is the program and which is the data? Well, the best I can come up with is that the program is the data that tends not to change very much, which is not a very, very satisfying definition, but I cannot come up with anything better. In fact, all you've got is memory. The Turing machine has no clue what is program, what is data. It just works. And all you've got is a bunch of memory. And so memory works on many time scales in physics, and also in biology. If you look just at the cell, ribosomal DNA, very conserved part of the DNA, millions, maybe billions of years old. Gene expression, matter of minutes or so, depending on your organism. DNA binding, microseconds. These are huge time scale ratios. And even the length scales are gigantic. You can easily get 1 trillion length scales. Usually we don't get this with computers, by the way. So if you think of a biological organism as a computer, I think that first of all, you're going to have to really move back from the program data dichotomy. Where's the program? Where's the data? Well, guess what? Everything is both data and program. You also have to go back and say, perhaps, until I understand time scales and length scales, I'm not going to get anywhere with this giant beast. So let's talk about scaling. In 1905, seems every talk has to mention Albert Einstein. So Einstein resolved Brownian motion. Why is this remarkable? Because after all, it sounds pretty simple, a bunch of particles bouncing around. But here's the thing. At the macroscopic level, this is a deterministic process involving Newton's laws, and it's intractable. So this is, a principled way of attacking the problem that is intractable. Now you can move up a little bit to the mesoscopic level and treat it as a stochastic process, the way we usually think about it, as a stochastic process. Now, which happens to be scale-free, which is very important in 1905, certainly, because the macroscope could not actually allow you to see those things. You could only see them at certain scales, not all scales. And so the scale-freeness was very important because it meant, well, since scale doesn't much matter, I can pick the scale that I prefer. And of course, you can remove randomness by moving to a macroscopic level. You get deterministic diffusion, which is solvable, okay? So let's summarize. This is kind of interesting because you have this upward causation from the macroscopic, which is deterministic. I'm not talking about quantum here. Deterministic, reversible, intractable. Then you introduce randomness, purely instrumentally, by the way. It's purely for the scientist's sake, not for physics' sake. Then at the mesoscopic level, you have stochastic motion, and further up, it's back to deterministic. You go back and forth, random, deterministic, just depending on what works. But the point is, and I'm sure all physicists will disagree with me, but I still believe it, that in physics, causation is mostly upward, okay? Whereas in biology, it's mostly both up and down. You have downward causation, and I can mention many examples of this. Well, first of all, I should define really what I mean by this, but perhaps adaptiveness is the best example of downward causation. And I was trying to illustrate this, and I was reading the New Yorker, and then I found the illustration. So here's this work. There's a fish here just having a grand old time, no predator could eat the little guys in here. So the little guys adapted and said, you know what, if we come together into a big fish, then that big fish will become a predator, and we downward, the downward causation from this emergent phenomenon down to this guy, and this guy now is in trouble, has to change its behavior. You see, I mean, this is a joke, but it's also meant to convey a serious point. So what I decided to do is, instead of spending time working on flocking and swarming and things that I've done in the past, and say, I want a model to study mixed scales, and particularly in biology. And so I just invent a very general model which allows me to do that, which will focus on the idea of scales, and that's I came up with influence systems. And the motivation was the following. What if you got to redesign the laws of physics so that every particle has its own law, which you designed? What would happen? Can you say anything that would happen? Now, of course, in biology, these laws, each law would evolve over time, but they might be very different, be a great amount of diversity. So think of n agents, we call them agents, which are points in RD, and since they are agents, I'll make it more visually pleasing by putting little human beings in here. And they live in RD, and here's what's going to happen. They are going to have a network, and they're going to talk to their friends through these arrows, and then on the basis of that, they're going to move. And then they will get another network, not the same, maybe the same, but not necessarily the same. And on the basis of their neighbors, they will move again in RD, okay? And so on. This goes on forever. Now, how are the networks formed? How is the motion proceeding? Let's talk about that. So, how the network is formed, I want this to be very general, because what I want to understand is emergence when scales mix. In other words, cognitively simple agents. How can they do great things simply via the power of interaction, not their own thing? So I want the network to have arbitrary power. You can have it small, big, it doesn't matter. So there's a function of the agent's position which determines the network, okay? For example, you could pick the two nearest, each agent could pick the two nearest neighbors. So typically each agent has its own algorithm, looks at the entire world globally, okay? And then decides who to talk to, okay? And so I'll make it as general as possible. Any first order sentence over the reals is okay. So anything where you have for all there exists, blah, blah. I mean, in fact, the agent could be playing games and the winner gets to decide whether to put an exercise. So it's a very general, it's a decidable theory. How do the agents move? So that again, remember, they could move in any old way, but I want to study cognitively limited agents. And so I'm going to restrict them to diffusion, which is to move. So again, when she moves, her next position is a function only of her neighbors and herself. So she has her own algorithm that on the basis of these three agents, herself and the two neighbors, so that's a grand total of 3D numbers as input, she will move. And let's assume that she moves inside the convex hull. And that's called a diffusive system. And it generalizes all diffusive systems, so it's probably, of all particular cases, the most important to study. And also it keeps the motion very simple. For example, the whole system cannot explode. It cannot go off to infinity. So again, each agent has its own interaction and motion algorithm. It's like each particle has its own law of physics, okay? And each one has its algorithm. What is the memory of this? Each algorithm has some memory, some variables, and this memory are the coordinates. So the position of the agent, these coordinates specify the contents of the memory, okay? It does not have to be just x, y in the plane or something. That's why it could be in very high dimension. It could have the temperature, the pressure, the concentration of this and that, okay? So to specify such a system, you need n, the number of agents, a set of formulas, which are specified by polynomials. So, there's this, and these are polynomials. So you would specify all the coefficients. And then a set of stochastic matrices to specify how they move. So it's just a bunch of numbers. So in fact, you can look at an influence system as a point in the space of all influence systems. There's a space of diffusive influence systems. And first you can ask, well, what can we say about this? It's a very rich theory. In particular, it contains all Markov chain theory as a very particular case, but it contains much more than that. It has Turing machines, for example, chaos, transit attractors, pretty much the whole regime of dynamics you can have here. So, okay, great. But I want to understand this picture better. So I showed last year that these two classes actually, they're not empty, but they have measure 0. Okay, now the schema is a big surprise to me, and so I want to tell you why. There are many ways why this is surprising. First of all the Lyapunov exponents of these systems are non-positive. Now, for people in dynamics and physics, this is very surprising that you would have chaos under such circumstances. Usually chaos means at least one positive exponent, but here that's not true, okay? Now, let's explore furthermore how this works. This has the behavior of a smooth analysis type of situation. So let me define what it means to perturb a diffusive influence system. So you take such a system and you take your formulas and you add an epsilon here. So it's a one-dimensional perturbation of a system. Okay, you move it. So in this way, for any system, you can move it a little bit left and right according to some epsilon. And I want to know what happens over here. This is going to be a very rich structure here. I mean, it could be very boring also. You could just have attractors here. But it could also be something like this. So if you zoom here, so this is a bigger version, you're going to have a Cantor set or some fractal structure. And all the Turing machines and chaotic system will live on these on this Cantor set, so of measure 0, but it's less than measure 0, okay? It's a fractional dimension less than 1. Everywhere else, it's asymptotically periodic, okay? And so to understand this, or actually to prove this, I had to resort to something I'd call better named dynamic renormalization, which is really how to analyze mixed scales. So maybe this will be more meaningful to the physicists, but if you look at the Ising model, which is a good example of condensed matter physics of complex systems, there are lots of similarities with my influence systems. For one thing, the agents keep interacting. And in Ising model, let's take the ferromagnetic for the simplest case. You have usually some excitation from the outside, okay, to keep things going. So particles keep jiggling. And that's a source of entropy in both cases. And you can formalize this. The agents want to move toward the neighbors. And the particles, they really want to jiggle like their neighbors, in sync with the neighbors. That's what this tension you have between entropy and energy that push in different directions. Now, sometimes entropy wins, it's disorder. Sometimes energy wins, and you have like a lattice, okay? But when there's a tie, sometimes, not always, but sometimes when there's a tie, what you get is criticality with second-order phase transitions, okay? There's continuous phase transitions, and where all kinds of interesting things happen. Now, before I get to this, there are major differences, okay? In influence system, topology changes endogenously. Topology changes all the time. This is crucial, whereas in Ising model, topology is fixed, okay? You live on a lattice. I have an infinite number of critical points. Usually there's a single critical point. And Ising model, you really study things in equilibrium or slightly outside of equilibrium. Here, these are completely out of equilibrium system, like biological systems are, okay? So to study the Ising model, there's an old technique which predates the Ising model, but the renormalization group comes from quantum mechanics a lot, and Kaidanov and Wilson and people like that. I mean, this is one of the great triumphs of 20th century physics. And so give you a brief flavor of what they do. I think for computer scientists, it's a rather natural notion. You have a lattice, so you break it up into, say, little blocks. It's called block. And what you want to do is coarse grain. So you have a dynamical system in here with this interaction with the outside world. You want to simplify the inners of this thing. So replace it by something that's simpler. And you do this everywhere. And then you do it again. You do the coarse graining to make things simpler. So you get a whole hierarchy at all scales of, lower scale and so on of coarse graining with the correspondence. Now, at the critical temperature, something magical is going to happen. So in those funny phase transitions, where you have these second order phase transitions, you're going to have very interesting phenomena like scaling law, power laws, and things like that. And what happened is, if you look at this coarse graining as a dynamics, where you go from one to another, so that's a dynamical system, then you look at the fixed point of that. And when you get the fixed point, this is what happens when basically all these three systems are the same modulo scaling. Modulo scaling, they are the same, which means in particular that since you know you have interaction here at the lowest level and you have interaction there, it means that you do have long-range correlation. Okay? This proves that if you perturb things a little bit here, there will be some reaction over there, which only happens at criticality. Is this me doing this? No. Oh, maybe. Okay. So can we do the same? Well, let's try. Okay, here's one graph at some point. It's going to disappear, okay, but let's look at it. Well, we look for some kind of decoupling. I mean, that's what renormalization tries to do. Well, here, for example, you notice that these three agents operate on their own because they don't talk to anybody else outside, and same here. So you could actually resolve these guys independently of the rest. Okay, whoops. Oh, good. So I will coarse grain them and replace them by bigger agents. I mean, they're bigger because they're coarse grained, so there's, we ask more of them. And now note already the mixing of scales, that this goose is on a different scale as these women because, okay, I think you got the picture. But if you're laughing, that means you're not getting the picture. You're getting another picture, which has, I don't even know what you're laughing about. And I'm saying this for the record. So anyway, there you are. Well, you can continue this. There's no reason to stop. So you just keep on doing this thing and try to find decoupling elsewhere in your things, and you have some nice hierarchy. Now, of course, this works only over some time window, because this thing is great, but this is very important that you have no red edges, because otherwise then the decoupling is completely wrong. So there's only a time window where this is going to work. Fine, there's a time window here. From T0, then T1, there's decoupling. So you do it again, and then you do it again. There's a whole infinite sequence of such things. Now, this cannot work. This cannot prove asymptotic periodicity, and this is probably the single most crucial difference between classical algorithms and natural algorithms, which is that classical algorithms, the way we like to study them is by looking at one orbit, or one input, maybe a putative input, worst case input or something, but there's one input, and what to follow, it's what happens. That's how we study, but this cannot work. You never prove this thing goes into a limit cycle by just following it blindly. You need a global characterization. So in fact, you have to look at the entire phase space and the way it is mapped. So it's worthless following one input. You have to look at all inputs and see how the space of all inputs is transformed, which of course is a bit more difficult because instead of this picture, now you're going to get some kind of tensor things, like a quantum-like beast, if you will, because now this has to represent all possible inputs, all possible starting configuration, okay? So you see you're running into a language issue. I mean, you cannot draw this, but how do you talk about it? So that's why you define this tensor thing. There's an algorithm called the flow tracker, which will build it, and build these tensor products. There are two kinds of tensors, and I'll get to this in a little while. But first, what is phase space? Let's make sure we're still together. So you've got n agents, and each one lives in D space. So the total of D times n numbers, okay? So phase space is R to the dn. Okay, a configuration of the system is a point in RDN. Now, when you look at the algorithm that follow a first order sentence to decide who talks to whom, I insisted on first order because it's a nice theory, including people from Berkeley here, that show that this theory has a quantified elimination, which means that in phase space you can draw an algebraic variety, a bunch of algebraic surfaces. They cut up phase space into rooms, into cells. And within each cell, the behavior is kind of the same. You have the same stochastic matrix. So you can even forget everything you've heard so far. Just think of a large space with this nice decomposition with algebraic surfaces. And each cell, each connected component, has a stochastic matrix. Okay? And the dynamic now is very clear. Start somewhere, and apply this stochastic matrix to it. So this goes there, and then this goes there, and so on. And you want to know whether it's chaotic, whether it's Turing machine, whether it's what. That's what you want to know. Okay, now it looks complicated, but we have methods to do that, okay? So again, to follow one point, one orbit, is useless. You got to follow, if not all of phase space, at least got to follow what happens to a ball, because this is really the crucial object to see what happens to a big body in space. So if you take a ball, it may or may not hit the boundary between two. So now you have two stochastic matrices. They will split up this ball into two sub-balls. Okay, my PowerPoint skills are not that great. So anyway, now you have these two others. And by luck, or lack of luck, they happen to also overlap between two regions, or more than two regions. It could be an exponential number of regions coming to a point. And so then you have 4, and then you have 8, and you see, you could have this explosion, or maybe not, or maybe yes. But so that's what you have to understand. So this gives rise to an arborescence, this sort of things. Now, so again, what I mean to say is what you need to understand is this. I took phase space and I squished it so you could look at it. And this is t equals 0. I want to know what happened to the phase space when I map it to time 1. There's a map. All these algorithms transform phase space, and I want to know what it looks like. Well, there's a good way of representing this, the coding tree, which you add one dimension, which is time, and then the arborescence looks like something like this. It's a tree, but it's a geometric tree. It actually lives in space, has volume, and so on. Okay? So again, make sure you understand. There's a little window here to explain. When you have a point here, say this is the starting configuration. It moves, this corresponds to this. And then it moves again, this corresponds to that. It moves again, it corresponds to that. Yeah, yesterday my flight was delayed a lot, so I could do that. And see, the coding tree has all the answers. I mean, literally, it's like the partition function of, it's got everything. Everything you should be able to read of the coding tree. The problem is you don't have the coding tree. You have it in your head, but it's not enough. Okay? But again, you can see this conflict, the same conflict you have in statistical physics between entropy and energy is played out here because entropy is the branching and energy is the thinning. So to put things in plain words, if the branching overwhelms the thinness, see, these branches are thinned out. They get thinner and thinner. If the branching overwhelms, and these are two exponential rates, if the branching overwhelms the thinning, you're going to have chaos, entropy, and so forth. I mean, chaos, Turing machines, and so on. I mean, not all of them at once. There will be a whole regime. But certainly, if you have energy decays faster than, I mean, in evolution, you have something very, very similar, okay? So it's probably a very, very deep principle you find in physics and also in biology and elsewhere. Now, the entropy is the easiest, so many ways you can define it. What you really want to get at is what's called the topological entropy, but actually it's easier to just define the entropy like this. It's just look at all the paths of length k and take the log, divide by k, and take the limit. Okay, that's the entropy. And you can show that this is 0, almost surely. And this is some matrix rigidity a la Valiant kind of argument about these matrices, okay? Now, criticality also involves energy, which is the more interesting part, okay? So these branches get thinner and thinner. You need to understand that. Now, thinning denotes a loss of free energy. I'll get back to the physical analogy later. Now, for periodicity, what you would hope to see is something getting thinner and thinner and thinner and going to a point, like a needle. If that happened, you would have always periodicity, okay? You can prove that. But unfortunately, you might get something like this, some kind of helical structure, and this is because the principal eigenspace can oscillate. Now, this is something we're not used to when you study Markov chains. Those guys never oscillate. But when you do products of stochastic matrices, you have the eigenspace corresponding to eigenvalue 1. that space can change back and forth when the matrices change. So as a result, you don't have this kind of thinning of the branch. So you need to understand better what's going on here. And for this, you need to understand the product of stochastic matrices, okay? And so for this, some years back, in work that preceded this, actually, so for different applications, I introduced the S energy. It's a function, it's a generating function specifically aimed to understand this concept. So take an infinite set of stochastic matrices, okay? And let G sub t denote the graph induced by P sub t. So a matrix induces a graph by looking at the non-zero entries. And compute this function. For any vector x, take p0 times x, take the ith coordinate, take the jth coordinate, raise to the power s, and sum over all edges of gt and then all times. And this might seem bizarre to you. However, if you remove the outer sum and you replace s by 2, you get the Dirichlet form, which is a standard tool in Markov chain theory. Okay? So it sort of generalizes this. But the key is to take s, not 2. No L2 norm business here. Okay? So first of all, you can show, because it's a Dirichlet series, it's invertible. It's actually a lossless encoding of the structure. I proved some bounds on these animals with some assumptions. And here's the thing, E of x0 is infinity, because when you think about it, this just counts the number of edges, which typically is infinite, because it's infinite number of graphs. So what you want to do is take s very close to 0, but not at 0. So the idea is to pick s near and derive Chernoff-like bounds. This is used very much in functional analysis. You have this extra parameter. It could be a frequency, it could be a temperature, it could be whatever. It's s. You know what happens when you set it to 0, and then you sort of... Here's a picture of... Some of these objects have analytic continuations, not all of them, but some do. And so I drew one in Mathematica, and you see what happens. This is the real axis. So you have the pole here goes to infinity. And then you have all the imaginary lines, have all these poles that repeat themselves. Now here's the intuition behind this. Why are we even doing this? I mean, I'm not going through the algebra or anything. I'll just give you a sense of why, at the basis of this, there's a very simple intuition, okay? And, okay, now look at a stochastic matrix. Take a row. That's a point in R4, okay? So it's got 4 rows, so it got 4 points in R4. Take the convex hull of that, okay? So that means that for a stochastic matrix, you can associate a polytope. Fine. So here's one, P1. P2, another stochastic matrix, which has another polytope. What happens when you multiply them? When you multiply P2 by P1, you can show that one lives inside the other. It's like Russian dolls. You can move one inside the other, okay? So when you have all these products, this is shrinking by definition. And you want to know, so let's say you study Markov chains. In Markov chains, they're all the same. So it's P, P squared, P cubed, and so on. And what you really want to know is how fast is the shrinking. But all the standard techniques are local. They tell you how to go from here to here and how much shrinking there is using Lyapunov exponents or spectral gaps, diameter, volume, all sorts of... People have gone with all sorts of things to study how you go from here to here. But this cannot work, okay, when you have this kind of situation because you can have long periods where there's no progress. So instead, the S energy is a global instrument. For a given value of S, it makes a statement about the entire sequence. And so now the question is to set the right value of S that works for you, okay? And so it's a global function, it's not. So in particular, if that's your idea of fun, you can rederive all the classical mixing bounds for Markov chain theory. But that's not the point of doing this. It's really that you can do much more, okay? So let's go back to our little thing here. Our flow tracker will produce formulas like this. And then what do we do with that? Here's the point. So we have, yes, thanks. So we have our systems. We look at the set of all such we look in phase space at the set of all possible starting configurations. We see how this evolves. We get this tree. Now the flow tracker produces these monstrosities. These are little trees, and it's like you're putting trees together, okay? So let me give you some intuition. What does the direct sum does? It takes two of these trees, and it takes the Cartesian product of all the paths. These trees are infinite, okay? So it's an infinite number of pairs that you can form, and then you form this other one, and there's a way you induce the width of the branches. And the direct product, so the direct sum is commutative, obviously, because it doesn't matter when you take this, but the direct product is not commutative, because what you do is you pick one guy and you stick it at the end, and then you repeat that for all the others. That's the direct product. It's a non-commutative operation. And the intuition is the following. You're going to have theorems that tell you what happens to the energy and the entropy of these trees when you add them up. Let's say you have a separate lemma that tells you what happens, and you have another lemma that tells you what happens when you take the products. Now, when you have a formula like this, you can just parse it term by term and see how these energy and entropy grow. That's the whole point. So the proof is inherently algorithmic because, and this is the main point, difference between renormalization in physics, which is in physics, this block decomposition is done independently of the physical process. Here, the decomposition of these graphs through these tensor products follows the dynamics of the graph. And so it's inherently algorithmic. It's not just a grid and just a hierarchy of grids. You don't know what it is ahead of time because it's produced endogenously by its own dynamics. Okay, so I have like 5 minutes or something, right? Or 3 minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minutes. Let me just summarize the theorem. Diffusive influence systems are asymptotically periodic almost surely. They can be chaotic or Turing complete. And bidirectional systems, I haven't talked about them, have fixed point attractors. We can count the number of attractors, although bound I have is not optimal. But the thing is, the mixing of time scale creates phenomena unknown in physics. Well, since I'm not a physicist, for me, almost anything is unknown in physics. So for me, this is probably true, and maybe not for John, but where he can tell me, suppose we have, and again, please, no stupid cracking, laughing. There's nothing funny about this business, let me tell you. So let's suppose that we have this situation here, and this trio pretty quickly settles. And so we can coarse grain it. There we go, okay? Now, at this point, suppose that the goose listens to her. The goose listens to her. Now, what happens? It means the goose gets information about this woman. Maybe her birth, telephone number, whatever. The goose gets information, okay? Now, see what happens. Now, through this renormalization and so on, you can show that these guys will evolve, and they will converge to a limit cycle, let's say. What does it mean to be stuck in a limit cycle? It means you've lost memory. It means that you have amnesia. That's what it means. Limit cycle means amnesia. You don't know where you come from. That's the whole point of being stuck in a periodic orbit. So everybody here is amnesic, has lost all information, and they have to if they want to be in a limit cycle. But now suppose that she decides, and she can do that, to talk to the goose much later on a different time scale. Remember, the goose has her information, and she has lost her memory. She will regain everything, because the goose will tell her name, will tell her where she was born, will tell her everything. So she regains her memory. But to regain your memory, maybe that's wonderful for her, but this is terrible for the limit cycle, because there's no limit cycle now anymore. You will have to lose memory again. So you see how you can amplify this, and you get this mixing of time scales. This time scale can be exponential. This time scale can be just a few steps. And they interact in major ways. Okay, so the view from physics, or pseudophysics, I should say, you can look at this as springs. Now, these are one-way springs. I know one-way springs contradict Newton's third law, but that's a small price to pay. So they have friction, because the whole thing it's a dissipative system, have friction, and the topology changes. I mean, you know, you can look at Markov chains as a system with springs, but these are two-way springs. And now, if you only had one-way springs with friction, then this would just be a damped couple oscillators. You would minimize the free energy, and the whole thing would converge. That's Markov chain theory. But because the topology changes from a physics point of view, this requires the import of more energy. So there has to be an injection of free energy from the outside that compensates for that dissipation. Now, this is something that Prigogine, you know, chemist, termed dissipative structures. And he argued that basically you go from physics to more complex things in life and so on by using these structures. I'm not sure many buy this, but I'm not sure that I buy this. This is too simplistic. Rather, what I think is that the big challenge for computer scientists who are interested in this, and biologists and so on, is really to find the language. And at this point, for me, it's a matter of language, not finding results. Because to find these algorithms is very, very difficult to find, you know, which variables to look at and so on. So even, you know, we'll do this later. But right now, I want to know, do we have analytical tools? What do we do with this thing now? And I think the biggest challenge is to capture the narrative complexity of natural algorithms. By narrative, I mean that there's a story unfolding, which is captured mathematically. So that's what I did in my work on influence systems, studying mixed scales. Right now, I'm a sabbatical. I'm working with Stan Leibler on open systems and adaptive structures. But that's ongoing work. And that's my talk. Thank you.
My apologies. In my introduction, I forgot to mention that Bernard is French, and these are the only folks who take G's seriously. Okay? Well, time for questions.
In physics, critical phenomena, usually there's some kind of hierarchy of critical points. You have critical points, you have multi-critical points, and there's some topology of the flow that sort of used to organize them. So is there something that applies in general, you can say?
Yeah, so
topology of the flow in these systems?
Yeah, so actually that's what I'm working on with Stan. We're looking at spin glass systems, because what you want is a large number of metastable states, and find, for topological reasons, how you could go from one to another by using selective, you know, because now we're mixing, you know, because we don't do physics, so we're just trying to use this idea to go through you know, subtle points that are exponentially narrow and force the flow through that by using natural selection kind of processes to sort of reinforce, like boosting kind of thing. But so we're looking at this in that sense. But I think it's that there has to be topological structure that facilitates the algorithmic unfolding of this. So I believe that, but I mean, I wish I could actually tell you results and so on. But I don't.
What are your principal discrepancy method?
Thank you.
Well, that's how I came to know about you. You made a statement about the Riemann hypothesis.
Oh, me? Oh, okay.
Yeah. I mean, you said something to the fact that the discrepancy method touched on that topic, plus the Red-Heifer matrix, you know, Red-Heifer matrix. Yeah. Now, in the context of all that, do you hold the view that scalability, which you did mention here, would be an important construct in the solution of an NP-complete problem? I mean, scalability, what do you have to say about that with respect to an NP-complete problem?
I don't think I have anything to say.
So the question was about the discrepancy method and how, if it relates to, as apparently claimed, to the Riemann hypothesis, and ultimately, if it can say something about NP-complete problem.
I mean, if you believe that NP completeness is hard, then it means none of these methods can be helpful. I mean, in the worst case. I mean, it means basically any sort of algorithmic technique you can dream up, it's going to be a waste of time. So now on average and so on, because we're not interested in worst case here. We're only interested about, and even average is a very loaded term because we cannot even define distributions. In fact, there's no distribution that are steady state. These are constantly out of equilibrium things. So, but though I do think in this system, the mere concept of optimization is again probably not the best term, because optimization puts you in a certain framework where lots of context is frozen. But organisms, you know, yeah, over the long-term memory, they optimize things, certainly. But they also do lots of other things. They change their utility function when it's time to do so. And so.
Any more questions for Bernard? We have some time. Let's thank the speaker again.
Thank you.